Hey, good afternoon. Running a little bit late today, but it's mostly on account of it's being really kind of a remote location out here in Pennsylvania. We're out in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, so I don't know if anybody knows where that is on a map. Just beyond Chambersburg, you can see, let me get a good view there, that's across there is Mount Parnell, highest point in Franklin County. It's where the old Forbes road from the French and Indian War, General Forbes cut a road across. So I see we're already getting the spammers that are putting up their financial phishing links. Please don't click on those. I will ban them later from the group. So that's the route that General Forbes, in the campaign of 1756, had to physically cut a road across Pennsylvania through woodland, and he came across a mountain gap in Parnell there, roughly parallel today to where the US Route 30 is, the old Lincoln Highway, and follows the same kind of track. So we are really in the foothills of the Alleghenies here, really in the foothills of Appalachia, and we are between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh. We're north of Hagerstown, Maryland. We're off of Interstate 81. We're in that kind of like western Maryland area, central western Pennsylvania area. And in the 1740s and 1750s, this was the area that was known as the Ohio Valley. So not for the state of Ohio, but for the Ohio River. River tributaries that came through here flowed towards the Ohio River. So the Allegheny flew this way, the Monongahela going this way. All those tributaries would eventually come to that Three River Point, that point in what's now downtown Pittsburgh, where they all join together as the Ohio River. So the area around here and the watershed here was known in that period as the Ohio Valley. So it now encompasses western Pennsylvania, parts of western Maryland, and parts of West Virginia. That's the geographic area that we're talking about. Now, why was this an important area? This was an important area because it was in the 1740s and the 1750s. This was the frontier. This was as far as the American colonies had come. It had come to the foothills of the Alleghenies. It had not really gone beyond this region. And American settlement has always been pushed, colonial settlement has always been pushed westward from the Atlantic coast towards, I'm going to move slightly to get a little bit more out of the wind, so I'm going to move to the side of the fort, see if we can use the fort as a windbreak. So American settlement and American movement has always been westward in nature. It's always been that go west, young man, the manifest destiny of the United States. To here I'm on the face of the fort now, just a little bit more out of the wind. We'll walk around a little bit later and look at some of the reconstruction work that's been done here. So this was the frontier, and the settlers, the English-speaking, German-speaking settlers of this region were pushing westward. Now they're starting to come into conflict with the French. Now the French are up in Canada, but the French have been able to move down through what was the Erie country. So if you're thinking about where Erie, Pennsylvania is, the French have moved down into this watershed area from the north, following the Allegheny River down from the north, and have started to establish a line of forts down the Allegheny towards the Ohio River. That's because their empire and their colony is expanding, and it's also a strategic move. If you follow the Ohio, and the Ohio flows south, and it will flow into, it's part of the Mississippi watershed, so it will flow into the Mississippi River. If the French control the north-south river from the tributaries of the headwaters of the Allegheny up in the north, all the way down through the Ohio River, all the way to the Mississippi, and the Louisiana territory, essentially, and will be able to build a series of forts, which they will try to do. They will try and build Fort Duquesne in what's now Pittsburgh. They'll build settlements around St. Louis and down towards what we know as Louisiana as a state today, but New Orleans. So the French, in creating that physical barrier along the water, north to south, will prevent British colonists, English-speaking colonists, from moving through that barrier. It physically locks off the settlement from those 13, well, more than 13, because you have to count like the Nova Scotias and all that kind of stuff, but from the original American colonies on the east coast that are seeking to move westward, are coming up against this physical barrier of a river frontier that's being supported by French forts. So Britain and France are at peace. It's one of those periods in which, remarkably, Britain and France are not at war. They regard each other as the historical enemy. So Britain and France have been at war really since the medieval period, the 100 Years' War period. They're at war, they're not at war. They're at war, they're not at war. They participate in religious wars. They participate in wars of succession. The French will interfere in Scottish politics. The British will interfere in Huguenot politics. So there's been centuries of animosity between the two countries. But this is a period in the 1740s and 1750s when the two nations are at peace. But they are sort of manoeuvring and struggling and skirmishing a little bit for colonial territory. Not only here in the Americas, but also on the Indian subcontinent. So what's now India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, that area, we have French and Indian colonies out there. So when the French and Indian War explodes into a world war that we know as the 7 Years' War, which could be regarded as the first genuine world war. So that 7 Years' War that takes place not just here in North America, but elsewhere, you have battles that are actually being fought in India as well as being fought here in the United States. So the whole idea of there being a French and Indian war, when we think of it traditionally being the Native American tribes here, the Iroquois Confederation, Seneca, Mingo, etc., here in the United States, we think of that as the Indian part of it. You could also, with a leap of logic, consider that to be the Indians from the Indian subcontinent. Anyway, it's getting back to the United States, getting back to North America. Let's get back to that. So there's this physical French frontier, and the French have established a fort, a small fort, very small fort, called Fort Duquesne. And it's in where the three rivers now come together in downtown Pittsburgh. So if you've been to Pittsburgh, you've been to a Pirates game, if you've been to a Steelers game, you know the area we're talking about, where those rivers come together, the three rivers. So there's a small French settlement there controlling the confluence of those three rivers. It's a small fort. You can't get more than maybe a couple of dozen people inside the stockade. So the stockade itself is really for a last-ditch fallback position. It's like a citadel, and it's also then storerooms. Outside of the fort will be where log cabins and tents and all that kind of stuff are, and a trading post and so forth. But the fort itself is a very small fort, but it is at the confluence of these rivers, and it is in a strategic location, which upsets the British. Upsets the British government, but it also upsets the colonial governors, such as Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia. Now, Virginia has that thing where Virginia considers the borders of Virginia just keep going and keep going and keep going. So today, Virginia just ends at sort of like West Virginia and Kentucky and doesn't really go that much further. But in 1754, Governor Dinwiddie believed that the borders of Virginia would just keep going and keep going all the way across the continental United States to the Western Ocean. So the idea that the French have blocked this river is upsetting to him. So what he does on his own initiative is that he decides he will send some of his colonial militia officers in a negotiating party, and that they will be sent to Fort Duquesne. So they've got to travel across this wilderness land. They'll be sent out across Pennsylvania, what's now Pennsylvania, into the Ohio Valley area. And they'll go to Fort Duquesne. They'll take a proclamation with them, and they will approach the fort, and they will call upon the French commander there. They'll read him this proclamation that says, this land belongs to the British Crown and you need to leave. One of the participants in that is a very young militia officer, no more than 21 years old at the time, George Washington. He's only 21 years old. He's quite an experienced, educated person by the standards of the day. He has a mechanical and a mathematical brain and is trained as a surveyor. So quite a prestigious career as a topographical engineer and surveyor, and has been appointed as a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia. So he's one of the officers that takes this proclamation to Fort Duquesne. Now, the proclamation at Fort Duquesne is handed over. The French, of course, reject that proclamation. And there is a bluff and a counterpoint in which Washington's small group have withdrawn from Fort Duquesne because they don't really want to bring on a military engagement. These are very small forces that we're talking about. But the French then arrive at the meadows in which Washington and his compatriots are camped with their own proclamation to read out, which says, this is the property of the French crown and you need to turn around and go back to where you came from. So there's a bit of a standoff. The historical record differs. Washington, in his official report, merely states that the French commander was killed and that there was some fighting. There are other reports by other British participants who wrote their own accounts that say that the shots were fired first actually by the colonial militia and the British force. And there are other accounts that say the initial attack took place with Iroquois Confederation allies of George Washington. Whatever the actual situation, it's one of those things where it's like we don't know who fired the first shot. There's no conclusive historical record on who fired the first shot. But what we do know is that the battle was a conclusive victory for the British force. So that force of colonial militia and its Native American allies. It was a victory. Several French troops are killed, many more are wounded, and about 20 or so are taken prisoner. Now, it's all been a terrible misunderstanding, I'm sure. The French sent a larger relief party to find out what had been going on. They approach Fort Necessity. Washington has entrenched and made a crude stockade, the Fort of Necessity, as he called it, and we've come to call it Fort Necessity. It's not a very well laid out fort. It's covered on high ground, so it's not that well, it's not so defensible. But that large French force approaches. It becomes really incumbent upon Washington to withdraw from that. And to do so, he signs an agreement. Now, George Washington does not speak nor read French. His translator is actually Dutch, so the man's first language is Dutch, his second language is English, his third language is French. So there are several clauses in this document written in French that George Washington signs his name to. The only clause that he strikes out is where it's pointed out to him by his interpreter that although they're allowed to withdraw with their weapons and take one of their cannon with them as an honour of war, they've got to leave all their gunpowder behind. And George Washington's like, well, no, we're not leaving our gunpowder behind, because if we're marching all the way back to Virginia and Pennsylvania with these militia, we're going to be attacked by French Native American allies, and we need gunpowder to defend ourselves. So Washington insists that is struck out. But there's a mistranslation, so the fact that the translator is translating from, in his head, from French into Dutch into English to Washington. There's a passage in the document in which it states that the French commander had been assassinated, so murdered essentially, by the British forces. It's mistranslated to Washington as merely that the French commander has been killed. So Washington acknowledges that there's been a fight and the French commander has been killed and signs off on the document. But in doing so has essentially admitted that the British came and they murdered the French, and it's all Britain's fault, and that will actually provide a casus belli, that will provide a reason to go to war, one of the reasons to go to war for the French government. So the conflict that erupts as a result of that is known in the United States today as the French and Indian War. because it's primarily in the United States concerning a war against the French and against the French Native American allies by the British regulars, colonial militia, and British Native American allies. So it's known as the French and Indian War. Worldwide, it will be known in history books as if you're at high school and you're doing, well, congratulations on taking your AP exams last week. But if you're doing AP World or AP Euro next year, that'll be known as the 7 Years' War. One of those conflicts between Britain and France that intermittently break out throughout multiple centuries of history. So here in the United States, though, it's referred to as the French and Indian War because the immediate fighting here is between the French and the Indians and the British and colonial allies. So there really is no British standing army, no regular soldiers in the United States at this period in the colonies. The colonies all have their colonial militias, and the colonial militias, by and large, have been responsible for maintaining security of the individual colonies. So the Virginia militia secures Virginia, the Pennsylvania militia secures Pennsylvania, and so forth. Now, to go to war with France and to actually physically expel the French from western Pennsylvania and the Ohio River Valley is going to require more than militia. It's going to require artillery, so you're going to require regular troops from professional artillerists, and it's going to require cannon. They're going to have to come all the way from England, and it's going to require some regular British troops as well, some redcoats. The British appoint a general, Edward Braddock, a Scotsman. They appoint him as commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America. So he's the commander-in-chief of North America. His deputy is a chap called Sinclair, who serves as his quartermaster general in charge of supplies. And so regular troops are sent from Britain to the colonies for the first time. Braddock sends Sinclair ahead of him as quartermaster general, saying, assemble wagons, assemble supplies, such as we're going to need horses, we're going to need oats and fodder for those horses, we're going to need hardtack bait for the men, we're going to need salt pork and salt beef put down for the men, we need ration supplies, collect whatever money you can from the individual governments so that we have a war chest that we can go to war with, and when I arrive we'll summon the militia and we'll march and we'll go to battle with the French. When Braddock arrives with the main body of the British regular force, he's met by Sinclair, and Sinclair has to tell him that the colonies are really not particularly interested, and so Braddock says, well, where are my wagons? There are no wagons. Where are my supplies? There are no supplies. And Braddock just kind of throws up his hands and says, well, this is ridiculous. We can't fight a war here unless we have logistical support. We can't fight a war here unless we have the support of the colonies. So we may as well write back to London and say, this is ridiculous. We should all just come home. And that's where Benjamin Franklin steps into the story. So Benjamin Franklin at this point is the Postmaster General of the Pennsylvania colony. So it doesn't sound like much. It doesn't sound like the Postmaster General. How is that an important point? But remember, government was much, much smaller in 1750. So if you live in Pennsylvania and you deal with the state of Pennsylvania's government today, you'll be aware of how large that government is and how many government employees and government departments there are. But in the 1750s, the government was much, much smaller. So even though it was smaller, and so the individuals that were involved in the government would have much more influence than they have today. That influence today is spread very thinly, but then it was concentrated in the hands of the governor, the governor's secretary, the governor's treasurer, and as postmaster, it's almost like a royal appointment as well. So Franklin was a man of influence in Pennsylvania. Franklin comes to Braddock and says, oh, this is terrible, Virginia's not giving you anything, and New Jersey's not giving you anything, and Maryland's not giving you anything. Pennsylvania will give you what you need. So Franklin commits the state of Pennsylvania to provide wagons, horses, and supplies for the expedition. So Benjamin Franklin is is the person that makes it possible for General Braddock to launch his campaign. So Braddock's campaign will be the first organised British attempt to drive the French out of this area, western Pennsylvania, and to secure this area as British land. The British have an alliance with the Iroquois nations, that the native inhabitants of this area, but the British obviously see themselves as the overlord, as the superior partner in that alliance. So yes, there are Native Americans here, but they see it as British territory. At the same time, there are some machinations going on behind the scenes. There's always money involved in these things. In early colonial history, there's always money in the background. And the money in the background is an organisation called the Ohio Company. So it's a private stock company that has been granted a charter that if they move 300 settler families into this territory and settle this territory for a period of time and maintain these settlers and make it with 300 settled British families in this area, they will be granted 200,000 acres of land. 200,000 acres of land. I don't know about you, but my house sits on maybe a quarter of an acre. We have paddocks for the horses that are maybe an acre here and 2 acres there. But so 200,000 acres is a significant chunk of land. So that's also part of the motivation for the colonists and the British to move into this area, is that it will push the French out of the way, and it will allow expanding the colonial enterprise into what we now regard as Ohio. Ohio, the state, will become Western Reserve territory. It will become part of Connecticut territory will be ceded to them, Pennsylvania territory. And that Ohio area will become allocated between the 13 colonies and has opened up land. So the Braddock expedition sets forth. Now the Braddock expedition has some problems that it has to deal with. I mean, I came here today on the last big road was Interstate 81, nice big highway, and pulled off of Interstate 81 onto some county roads, and they're well paved. There were no roads out here at the time. There was no US 30, there was no Lincoln Highway, there was no Forbes Road. So Braddock essentially has to cut his way through the wilderness. He does that with a group of pioneers, a battalion of 300 pioneers armed with axes and saws that literally have to cut trees out of the way. Cut the stumps of those trees down low enough that the axles of wagons can pass over them, and cut a trail through the trees that Braddock can bring his wagon train and his artillery train with him. Now, fighting in North America up until this point has not really involved heavy artillery. If artillery has been involved, it's been very small battalion guns, very small field pieces, 2 and 3 pounder guns. But Braddock is bringing with him big artillery because he says, if I'm going to come up against a fort with stockade wall like this, I don't want to be firing ping pong balls at it. I want to fire something solid that's going to knock a hole in it. So he's actually bringing artillery with him and bringing artillery to a North American war for the first time. So it's necessary to carve this road, a very slow moving column, very slow moving, as every yard of ground has to be cleared ahead of this column that's moving forward. It's about 2,000 strong in total fighting strength. That includes British regulars, it includes colonial militia, including once again Lieutenant Colonel Washington of the Virginia militia, who's there with the Virginia Blues, the uniformed, quite well trained regulars, quite well trained militia of Virginia. They form part of the baggage guard and the rear guard. But Washington is assigned to Braddock as an aide-de-camp. So there's a few issues within the command structure of the British and the colonial army, which is that a British officer commissioned by the king, commissioned by the crown, holding the king's commission, will always outrank a militia officer commissioned by the governor. So George Washington holds a lieutenant colonel's commission signed by Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia, but the lowliest ensign and the lowliest captain in a British regiment holding a commission from the king is not obliged to take any orders from this militia lieutenant colonel. But Washington has experience on the frontier as a surveyor from the previous expeditions that he's been on. And so his opinion is valuable to Braddock, and his input is valuable to Braddock. And so to circumvent this silly notion that a British captain doesn't have to listen to a colonial lieutenant colonel, Braddock appoints Washington as an aide-de-camp, as an assistant to the general. So Washington's authority is now come down from Braddock. So if Washington says we need to do this, that has the authority of the general, the commander-in-chief, behind him, and he has to be listened to. So the column is moving very, very slowly, and General Braddock becomes worried that the French will send a relief column to Fort Duquesne and will send reinforcements and cannon, and by the time he gets to Fort Duquesne, instead of there being about 50 Frenchmen there armed with muskets, he's going to come up against 500 or 1,000 Frenchmen and Native American allies with some cannon, and he's going to have a real fight on his hands. So at the suggestion of Washington, they decide to detach what they call a flying column, an advance guard. About 1,200 men. They leave their wagons, they just take their small packs with them, cram them with whatever supplies they can, and they're going to maneuver their way through the woods and move on foot as quickly as they can towards Fort Duquesne. Now, they move very quickly, but by the time they get there, of course, it's a little too late, and the French have arrived in force, and the French Native American allies have arrived in force. So a battle begins, the Battle of Monongahela, and in which this advance guard is heavily engaged. A lot of the men in this advance guard, so when we talk about British regulars, you think like, oh, these are hardened men. So let's think of the British Army in 1914. That British Army, the old contemptibles, those regulars, those salty veterans with 10 and 20 years service that have been in the army that long, that march off to war in World War I in 1914. Very highly trained, they can fire, in a mad minute, they can fire 30 rounds per minute, but they can fire 10 rounds aim per minute. They're very, very, very competent, very, very well-trained soldiers. Now, a recruit in 1754 that's been brought out here to the Americas may have been lucky to have fired his musket once or twice, and has predominantly been used as a labourer to build stockades or cut roads. They know how to march, they know how to stand in line, they know how to load and fire a volley, but they're not as trained and experienced as the militia and backwoodsmen and Native American troops, certainly. And so when the engagement breaks out, and they stand and they attempt to fight, it's under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Gage, a British regular officer. So Lieutenant Colonel Gage is in command of that advance guard. He forms his men traditionally into line, fires volleys, but particularly the Native American allies of the French, they don't stand in line and fight. They fight from behind trees, they fight from behind rocks, they climb up onto hills and high ground and fire down from there. So they're able to pick off British troops one by one. The British are firing volleys and standing out in the open, and the people they're fighting against are under cover and firing single, more aimed shots. The attrition is particularly horrendous against British officers. British soldiers are on foot. Their officers, being gentlemen, are mounted on horses. They present much more identifiable targets. You can knock a man down off the horse, or you can knock the man's horse down and trap him underneath the horse. And they're also identifiable by their brightly polished silver gorget and the more fancier and cleaner uniforms than the regular soldiery. So the toll on officers in this column, there's about 80-something officers in this column, and very soon we're down to about 20 officers, a good 60 of those officers. So 3/4 of the officers become casualties very early on. Now, without that command structure, the younger British recruits, the more experienced British recruits waver and break, and there's a bit of a rout. So Colonel Gage attempts to form a rearguard and hold some kind of a line with his regulars, but it doesn't hold that well. The British regulars retreat upon the train, upon that baggage train and artillery train, and upon the militia. The saviour of that battle really is the Virginia militia, about 180 men in a regiment, so a very small unit. and they're known as the Blues because their uniform is blue. They form a rear guard. They know how to fight a more dispersed, light style of fighting. They don't have to stand in line. They know how to get behind a tree. They know how to get behind a rock. And Sinclair, the second in command, Braddock's quartermaster general, is a man with years of experience of fighting. He comes to Braddock and he's been wounded, he's mortally wounded, shot through the chest. He addresses him in Italian and tells him, if you need to survive, we need to get the men up onto high ground. He probably addresses him in Italian because he doesn't want to scream it out in English and panic everybody, so he addresses him in a language that Braddock may understand as a travelled gentleman, and the necessity to get the troops up on the high ground and try and fight a dignified withdrawal. Washington suggests to Braddock that they fight American style. The British method of fighting, standing in line, firing volleys, is not going to be effective. You need to fight American style. You need to disperse. You need to be in a more broken formation, use light infantry tactics, use cover, and the way that the French are fighting us, we need to fight them in exactly the same way. And that's exactly what the Virginia militia do in the battle, and act as a rear guard, which gives the rest of the British troops more of a chance to get away. Now, of course, the British have to abandon several things on the battlefield. They abandon supply wagons, they abandon their artillery train. They particularly abandon a wagon that is full of trade goods that have been initiated to £2,000 worth. Now, £2,000 is a lot of money back then. £2,000 worth of trade goods that have been allocated to trade with Native American tribes. So the slaughter of the British troops, really, they are absolutely overwhelmed. They don't know how to fight against these tactics. When they're attacked and they're knocked down, if Native Americans come to them, they will finish off the wounded. There are scalpings, the scalps are nailed to trees. It's a very horrific, bloody battle, which could have continued, except the French and the Native American allies of the French come across the baggage and come across the trade goods and begin looting the column and drinking the rum, and the pursuit slows, which really essentially allows the British to escape. But not without loss, and one of those losses is General Braddock. It's a rough day for Braddock. He has 5 different horses shot out from underneath him. Washington has 2 horses shot out from underneath him. So you can see that officers are a particular target. And Braddock is eventually mortally wounded, and he'll be buried on the battlefield. And one of his last requests is that his body not be despoiled by Native Americans or taken as a trophy by the French. And so Washington has Braddock buried in the middle of this cleared roadway that had been cleared, and then has troops march across the grave as part of the retreat, so the trace of the grave is removed. I mean, it will eventually be rediscovered when a modern highway is put through, I believe in 1900s, so maybe 20th century. The highway's put through, they find a grave burial, then they are able to identify from cloth and buttons that this may be Braddock's remains, but he's buried in an unmarked grave so that it can't be despoiled. So that's the end of that initial British campaign. Now, it could be that the British now say, well, okay, that was a complete and utter disaster, and we're not going to do that again, so let's come to a peace settlement with the French and we'll restrict immigration to this thing. But the colonists want to push west, and the British government says, yeah, we kind of want to push you guys west too, and the French are in the way, and the French are being inconvenient again. It's our historic enemy. This is a good time to, give Johnny Francois a good thrashing, pull his pants down, give him a good thrashing. So they decide they will double down on the effort and have another campaign the next year. The campaign in the next year will be under the command of Major General Forbes, new commander, yet another Scotsman, commander-in-chief of British forces here. Will follow roughly the same route towards Pennsylvania. So when we talk about Forbes Road, he takes a lot more time and a lot more thought goes into the road that is cutting across Pennsylvania. It roughly parallels today what we know as US 30. So if you follow US 30, okay, US 30 goes coast to coast. It's one of the coast to coast highways. Starts in Atlantic City, on the Atlantic, bombs through Pennsylvania, goes right across the country, all through Yellowstone National Park, and poof, out into Oregon territory. That's where it goes today. But at the time, the Forbes Road, of course, went from the settlements around Harrisburg, around Carlisle, Pennsylvania, that kind of area, and then cut west towards what's now Pittsburgh. That was the route of Forbes Road. So that's the initial part of what we now call the Lincoln Highway, what we now call US 30. That was the initial section of that road that was cut. And I'm going to have to move my jacket because they are cutting grass today for hay, and I don't want to get my jacket mowed down. Hold on 1 second, folks. Just recovered my jacket. So, Forbes takes a lot more time and a lot more thought goes into the cutting of this road and the cutting of this track. One of the things that he does is he wants to secure the line of communications. And that's how we end up with a fort like here at Fort Loudon. So Fort Loudon is now in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. It is a logistical base, essentially, that protects the line of communications for the British troops. Oh. I think wherever I go today, I think the lawn care guy is going to come up behind me. So I'm going to walk way across from the fort and let him mow his lawn, and we can get a good view actually of the fort. The further I move away from it, the more you'll see the reconstructed nature of this stockade that's here. Okay, so behind me you can see pretty much the extent of the fort itself. It's a very simple wood stockade, bastions on each of the corners. The bastions are big enough to put on a small field piece, a 2 or 3 pounder. Could also be used for musketry. If you're inside the fort, you can see there are firing steps and there are loopholes cut in the stockade for musketry. But it's a very small fort, and it was predominantly as to guard the line of communication, as a supply depot. And this was built by the Pennsylvania militia in, I believe, the winter of 55-56. So completed in 1756 by the Pennsylvania militia. Built in like 2 or 3 months, just using hand tools. So what we're looking at today is a reconstruction. There've been reconstructions before here. And the original reconstruction, I think, was 1993. This reconstruction dates to, they began the reconstruction here in 2018, so it's a very modern reconstruction, but using traditional methods. So when you're inside and you look at this stockade, it's all wooden pins, there's no nail gun work here. There's a man working up on top of the barrack block there at the moment, setting stone into the chimney place. It's a stone chimney on a shingled roof on a wood barrack. So we'll have a look around later on. I'll take some photographs and post some photographs as well. But this is a reconstruction started in 2018. The reconstruction is still ongoing. They're working inside at the moment on finishing that barrack block, and also started work on some stables inside. But this was typical of the logistical chain that Forbes knew that he would need. He wanted to make sure that there'd be supplies forward, there'd be supplies here at Fort Loudon, there'd be supplies at Fort Bedford. So the chain of forts along Forbes Road would protect the road from raids. It would be this point of refuge settlers in the community could fall back upon here. They'd become useful as a trading post for trading with Native Americans. It would become a centre of commercial activity. So down in the valley, below here is the actual town, small town now, of Fort Loudon. About 800 people live there now today, but it's a small community. So communities evolved around these forts and these settlements. You go out to Fort Bedford. Bedford, Pennsylvania is exactly the same today. That's you can see how the community grew up around the fort. So Fort Loudon was one of those places. There was no battle here during the French and Indian War. The French did not advance this far back into Pennsylvania and attack this fort, but it was very important as part of the line of communication, as part of establishing British control of this, what was the Ohio Valley, western Pennsylvania, moving into Pennsylvania and opening that up for further colonization. So it's important that these forts are built as centres, and if you think about it, it follows a very logical way. It's almost essentially the same way as the Romans established colonies. So when the Romans came to Britain, the Romans had to fight wars to defeat the Trinovanti and defeat the other tribes and establish physical control over the land. But then what did they do? Well, then they built settlements with some fortification in them. So they built Londinium, and they built Verulamium, St Albans, and they built Colonia Claudia Vitraceus, they built Colchester, and they built these settlements that could be garrisons. They could be where retired soldiers began farming, and colonists could establish themselves as farms, centres of trade, but also centres of protection. So if there was any kind of uprising in the neighbourhood, people could fall back upon that settlement as a place of safety. It's the same here in the colonial pattern here in the United States. As the colonization moves west, you see these settlements here in Pennsylvania. When you think of a fort, you think of like Fort Laramie out in Wyoming. You think of historic Fort Hays down in Kansas. You think of those historic western forts from that period, black and white cowboy movies with Errol Flynn being General Custer. That's the kind of fort you think about. You don't really think about it back in the colonial period, and yet this is exactly where the original idea for these fort systems, as you push westward and you colonize westward and you bring settlers into the west, you protect them with these posts and these trading settlements. So that was the function essentially that Fort Loudon here in Pennsylvania served as a logistical spot, as a protecting the road, protecting the highway against raids, and protecting the local settlements. The fort here stood for about 9 years, in use for 9 years. It was garrisoned for 9 years. Then there was the period before the American Revolution, before the War of Independence, is of course that turbulent period in which colonists, the colonial forces, the colonial patriots are starting to feel the need for independence, are starting to feel that spirit of independence, wanting to break away from British control. So there are small uprisings and small outbreaks of violence long before the actual shots are fired on Lexington and Concord and the Declaration of Independence the year later. In the years up to it, in the 1760s, when you have all these revolts against British taxes and British tax collectors and the British presence in places, local militia, known as the Black Boys, but local Pennsylvania militia, there's a monument to them just to the side of the fort here. I'm going to snap a photo of that and post it up to the page. But the local militia come to the fort and say, it's time for you to go. We don't need a British garrison here anymore, guys. It's like 1763 and there's no real French and Indian stuff going on anymore, so you can go. We're Pennsylvanians. We got this. We got control of this territory now. You can leave. And so the garrison departs and the fort falls into disuse and not being needed anymore. It's not maintained. If you've got a stockade like that, that's a beautiful source of lumber if you want lumber for something else. So we know how expensive timber is at the moment with shortages of cut timber for construction. So if you can be like, well, there's an old fort down there, and I can take some of those logs and use those to prop up my barn or cut those into planking and use that for housing or for fencing, then there's some ready-made material here that you can take advantage of. So the fort is then lost to history. If you're downtown in the town of Fort Loudon today, there's a historical marker down there which talks about 1 mile north of here is where the fort stood, and the fort was removed in this period. But this reconstruction here, dating to 2018, is a beautiful reconstruction. If you have the opportunity to come out here, Fort Loudon, Pennsylvania, it's on the internet, easily findable. You come out here, you get a warm reception from the folks out here. There are often events held here, historical reenactment events. So there'll be a Scottish Highlander festival out here. There'll be a historic festival with lots of reenactors from different periods out here. There's always events going on here, craft markets, etc. There's a visitor centre here. Check ahead of time to make sure what the opening hours are. Even if the visitor centre is not open, even if the fort is not open, you can walk around the outside of the park. Counts as a town park for the town of Fort Loudon. So it's open from dawn till dusk. There's a little river down here. People park up here and come and fish in the river. So even if you're kind of like in the area or at Gettysburg and you're thinking of doing Chambersburg and you're driving these back roads and you think, I'm going to pull off a Route 30. Route 30 runs right past us. So pull off a Route 30, come down a mile of driveway, park your car, have a walk around. Great place for a picnic. So even if the fort's not open, do come in. I'm going to post details of the upcoming events. There's a notice board here with all the events that are coming up in 2022. So I'm going to post details of those events. So if anybody's in this area or anybody's within travel distance of this area and is thinking like, yeah, I'd love to come to like the Allegheny Uprising and look about the Black Boy Rebellion against British authority here. Before the American Revolution, so sort of like pre-revolutionary activity from these patriots. I'd love to know about that. Well, there's an event coming up, so I'll post details of that, and people, if you want to, you can come out to that. This would be a great place to bring a school party if you're doing AP US History. If you're doing, so in high school, if you're doing AP US History, great place to come out and have a look around, get a feel for what the American frontier looked like in the 1740s and 1750s, and really get that into you that Western Pennsylvania was once the West, was once the frontier. That really was the frontier. The Wild West was Pennsylvania. So come out here if you're doing that, if you're doing Pennsylvania history, Maryland history, colonial history. When do guys do that? 4th grade, 5th grade, so elementary school. Parents, if you've got kids in those grades and you want to bring them out and like walk around this fort, please do. It's just great. We're not that far from Gettysburg. So if you're visiting Gettysburg, and there's some additional French and Indian War history close by that you can come to and talk about a different period of history as well. So, as always, I would encourage any school teacher that if you can bring a class out here and sit on the grass, okay, when the guy's not mowing, fine. But if you can bring a class out here with picnics and sit on the grass and teach your class here, why would you not do that? Why would you want to sit in the classroom every single lesson? You could carpool out here, you could get a bus out here. Come and sit at a location. If you're going to teach about the Civil War, take a bus to Antietam. Sit on the wheat field above the Dunker Church at the cornfield there and talk about the fight. I mean, you don't have to do it from the classroom. That's partly what inspired me to come out on Tuesdays and do these talks, is you do get bored standing in front of a chalkboard or a dry erase board writing, on July 3rd, 1863, Pettigrew, Trimble and Pickett did so. It can be a little bit boring for you as the teacher to do that for the 100th time. It's not that great for a kid and just watching you chalk something up on a board. Get out on locations and whenever you can, get outside. There's always history on your doorstep. You might not think there's history on your doorstep, but you can always find history on your doorstep. Even if it's a trip to a local graveyard where you'll find grave markers for Daughters of the American Revolution that have been marked, or veterans of the Grand Army of the Republic, or things like that. There's always physical connections that connect us to the past in our local communities. And so get outside, bring kids, school teachers, bring your kids outside. Okay, I know we're kind of like winding up for the year now, and we're looking forward to the summer. But you know, if you can get out in the fall and get your kids out for a couple of days and day trips, then please do. Look for any source of funding you can get. American Battlefield Trust, plug for those guys, plug for their website, plug for their YouTube channel. Some fantastic videos up there at the moment from Gary Edelman. Hi Gary. So great resource. Teachers, high school teachers, middle school teachers particularly, if you're thinking of a field trip for Antietam, for Gettysburg, you can apply for grant money to get your kids to a field trip. Help get some grant money from American Battlefield Trust. That could be some seed money to get you out on those trips. So high school teachers, middle school teachers, American Battlefield Trust, have a look for scholarship money, grant money on there, but any other sources you can find. We've often had help in the past from VFW and American Legion. They're often very generous with donations for schools that want to get out to historical locations. So please, if you teach it, take advantage of all that stuff. Get your kids outside whenever you can, so they can put their hand on that stockade, or they can sit on the ground and they can look at something and say, I see there's a notch in the trees up there on Parnell Mountain, and there is a notch actually up there on the trees, and the notch is the old Forbes Road. So the new gradient of US 30, of course, is in the valley, on where it's much easier to build a modern road. But the original notch, the gap in the hill where they put Forbes Road through, still up there. So I mean, if you really wanted to hike up there, you could get up there. So that's really the story of what I wanted to talk about the French and Indian War in Pennsylvania. So you don't really think of Pennsylvania as being a battleground. And you hear a little bit about maybe Fort Duquesne and maybe the conflict over who owns what's now modern Pittsburgh, and some conflict for that. But you don't really think of Pennsylvania as being anything other than the Pennsylvania Turnpike with Philadelphia at one end and Pittsburgh at the other end. That's typically how a lot of people think of Pennsylvania, particularly with a sports team at one end and a sports team at the other end. But Pennsylvania in that period, in the 1730s and the 1740s, and even to the 1750s, whereas the east of Pennsylvania, around Philadelphia and Brandywine Valley and the Delaware watershed, all those areas there were well settled with English and Scottish and German, and also some Dutch and some Swedish and some Danish immigrants in that area, good farmland, well-established colonial property. You come a little bit further out, towards the west, and we're not that far west. We really are still across the Appalachian Trail, coming in on Interstate 70. We're only really on Interstate 81. We're just a smidge away from that, so look on a map and see where Interstate 81 comes all the way down from New York, and it comes all the way down, cuts through a little bit of Maryland, cuts through into Pennsylvania, then cuts through into Virginia and goes down the Shenandoah Valley. So you can see we're not really that far across. We're really this side of the Blue Ridge, and properly this side of the Alleghenies. We're really in the foothills of all of that, and that was the frontier. So just getting that idea of that the frontier was so close. When we talk about the cluster of, how much of the population of the United States today still lives on this East Coast corridor, we're a very coastal nation. This whole, you can drive all the way from north of Boston, all the way south down Interstate 95, probably without a break of urban strip malls and towns and cities, all the way down 95, certainly till south of Richmond, Virginia. It's this solid Boz, New York, Wash, Matt sort of conglomeration of humanity that's here. And to push west, and we're only a little bit further west than that today, in what was once the Wild West and the frontier. So it's kind of very, very unusual to sort of think oh, well, I'm in this place, and if I go down the road, there's a Dunkin' Donuts, and there's Bob Evans, and there's a gas station, and there's Walmart, all that stuff that you normally associate with your community. And you don't really think that, when you look up on that hill line there, that in 1756, General Forbes has got a corps of pioneers with axes and saws chopping a road across that hill. Hang on, let's get the right side. No, this side. Chopping a road across this hill line here, to go out to what's now Pittsburgh and fight the French in Pennsylvania in barely more than 200 years ago. So, you know, we're coming up on the 225th anniversary of the Revolutionary War, the American War of Independence, Declaration of Independence. That will be coming up very, very soon for us. And it's not really that long ago in human history to think that this was once a frontier, and that we can come out and we can walk around and we can explore what was the Wild West in what's now the very, very settled and very, very peaceful East. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. I think I've gone on for almost an hour of me waffling and talking. So I'm going to go into the fort. They've kindly opened that up for me today. I had marvellous welcome and reception here today. Normally when I come out and things are closed, they just remain closed and you kind of have to walk around, but they made a point of opening up for me today and allowing me to wander around. I'm really, really grateful to everybody here at Fort Loudon. And so I'm going to take advantage of that. I'm going to go in, take some photographs, take a little bit of video if I can, and from the inside. You have to be careful with that because there's some construction going on, so I don't kind of want to intrude on that. And but so we'll go in, we won't do a live stream from that, but we'll do some static video and some static photographs. You can see the inside of the fort, the firing steps, and the inside of the bastions and that kind of thing. So thank you for joining me this afternoon. There is another tour today. I'm actually at 5 o'clock this afternoon. I'm going to be down in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. So that way on US 30, heading back towards on 30, heading back towards Gettysburg and towards York. And I'm going to be in Chambersburg. I'm going to be talking about Jubal Early's raid of 1864 and the burning of Chambersburg, the ransom. What is it when you ransom something? The extortion. He basically tried to extort money and supplies from them, and then he got angry and burned the town down. So I'm going to be doing a talk there, 5 o'clock this afternoon Eastern time, so adjust for wherever you are watching this in the world. So getting 2 tours today because I just happened to be out this way, and I thought, why not do 2 today while I'm out in the area? And especially with the price of gas at the moment, I kind of want to take advantage of when I'm out in an area to do as much as I can. So hope you enjoyed the talk today. Hope it gave you some things to think about. It's probably going to send you away now. French and Indian War, you're going to want to go on Amazon Prime and look for Last of the Mohicans and watch that movie again. It's a really great movie, really great battle scenes in that as well. I will recommend some books. I will recommend some podcasts. There's a marvellous podcast on the history of the Iroquois Nation, which covers the Native American participation in the French and Indian War. I'll post a link to that podcast. Some really interesting conversations in that podcast. I'll post some links to some books and maybe some primary sources. Depends how readable those are, archive.org and so forth, whether they're readable in a readable format. I like sources where you can click on a page and it turns rather than you have to like scroll through it like old-fashioned microfiche, which can be very taxing on the eyes on small screens today. So I'm going to post all this stuff, post some photographs, post some additional information. Hope you enjoyed it today. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for all the support you give Walking the Ground. Click on the likes, click on the shares. This will be recorded, it'll be uploaded to YouTube for future reference, so find it on YouTube. Anybody you know that's interested in history, share the links with those, the more the merrier. And I will see you guys at 5 o'clock Eastern down in Chambersburg. But right now at 1 o'clock I'm going to go and get myself a coffee. Thanks for joining me today.